The last week of November came to Denver the way a debt collector arrives without warning and with no interest in excuses. The cold that year was the kind that worked its way through insulation, through old wood, through the thin wool of a man's coat sleeve and directly into the bone. It was the kind of cold that reminded you of every bad decision you had ever made, starting with the roof you kept meaning to fix and the weather stripping you kept meaning to replace. Ethan Cole stood at the kitchen window at 10:30 in the evening, watching the snow come down in slow, heavy curtains. The street lamp outside had been flickering for 2 weeks. Nobody had come to fix it. The orange light stuttered and pulsed in the storm, casting long shadows across the yard. And Ethan watched it the way you watch something you have given up expecting anything from. Inside, the house was quiet. The old cast-iron radiator in the hallway ticked and groaned with the effort of warming a space it was probably 20 years past capable of warming. Ethan had already plugged the gap under the front door with a rolled bath towel. He had already checked the pilot light on the furnace twice. He had made a bowl of oatmeal for dinner because it was what they had, and he had eaten it standing at the counter so that Sophie could have the chair closest to the heat vent. Sophie was 6 years old and had been asleep for an hour. She slept in the way that small children sleep when they have had a full day completely, with total conviction. One arm thrown out toward the edge of the mattress and her breathing steady and deep. Ethan had stood in her doorway for a moment before coming to the kitchen. He did that most nights. He was not sure why. It was not something he could explain, only something he needed. 3 years since Claire had died. 3 years was long enough that the grief had changed its shape from the first year, which had been like standing inside a burning building, to something slower and duller now, more like carrying a stone in your coat pocket. You forgot it was there sometimes. Then your hand brushed it, and you remembered. He was about to turn off the kitchen light when he heard it. A knock at the front door. Not a confident knock. Not the kind of knock that announces itself. This was the knock of someone who was not sure they had the right to be knocking at all. Ethan stood still for a moment. The snow ticked against the window glass. The radiator groaned. He crossed the hallway and put his hand on the doorknob and opened it. There are men who wear their hardship with a kind of pride, the way some people display trophies. Ethan Cole was not one of those men. He wore his difficulties quietly. The way you wear a shirt that has been washed too many times, it still functions, it still covers you. But anyone paying attention can see the thinning at the elbows. He had been a certified HVAC technician for 11 years. He knew heating systems the way some men know engines or horses intuitively, by sound and smell, by the particular way a motor stuttered before it failed. He was good at his work. His customers in the Westwood neighborhood knew him by name and called him first when their boilers gave out in January, and he always came. The problem was that being good at your work and being paid fairly for it were two different negotiations. And Ethan had never been much of a negotiator. He worked for a small contracting company, Caldwell Mechanical, where he took on whatever jobs came through the dispatch board, often 12-hour days, often in basements where the asbestos insulation was of uncertain vintage and the crawl spaces required a man to move on his elbows like a soldier under wire. He earned enough to pay the rent and the utilities and Sophie's school lunch account, with a remainder that sat in his checking account at the end of the month like a polite but insufficient apology. The house on Garfield Street was a rental, a narrow, 2-bedroom wood frame built sometime in the 1940s, with a foundation that had settled unevenly so that all the interior doors hung slightly wrong, and you had to lift the kitchen cabinet to get it to close. The landlord, a retired postal worker named Gerald who lived in Aurora, sent a plumber out twice a year, whether anything needed it or not, and otherwise left Ethan to manage. This arrangement suited them both. Sophie had adapted to the house the way children adapt to everything completely and without complaint. She had arranged her bedroom according to some private architectural logic that made sense only to her, with her drawings tacked to the wall above the radiator, and her stuffed animals arranged in a specific order on the windowsill that Ethan had learned not to disturb. She went to Emerson Elementary 6 blocks away and had 2 best friends, Maddie and Zoe, and was currently deeply interested in a library book about dolphins. She had her mother's eyes gray-green, wide, with that particular quality of attention that makes a person feel they are being taken seriously. What Ethan did not have, and what the houses around him seemed to have in easy abundance, was any sense that the situation was temporary. He could not see, from where he stood, the version of his life that was bigger or easier. He could only see the next bill, the next job, the next morning with Sophie, which was the version he chose to look at because it was the one he could do something about. He had made a habit of eating lunch alone in his truck most days, parked outside whatever building he was servicing, with a thermos of coffee and a sandwich he had made at 6 in the morning, and then largely forgotten about by noon. It was not an unhappy ritual. It gave him time to think. Or to not think, which was sometimes the more valuable option. He would sit and watch people move along the sidewalk and consider, with a degree of equanimity that had taken years to develop, that most of them were carrying something he couldn't see and that this was probably fine. Claire had been the one with the talent for looking forward. She had kept a list, an actual paper list, in a small notebook of things they were going to do someday, places they would go, projects for the house, things they wanted Sophie to experience when she was old enough. He had found the notebook in the weeks after she died, and had read it once and not read it again. It was in the back of his sock drawer. He checked, occasionally, that it was still there. He did not know what he would do if it wasn't. He did not know what to do with it as it was. The night before the knock at the door, he had sat at the kitchen table after Sophie went to sleep and worked through the month's expenses on a yellow legal pad. The furnace needed a new heat exchanger by spring or it would fail. He had written the number down and looked at it for a long time and then turned the pad over so he did not have to keep looking. He had made coffee instead and sat with it until it went cold and listened to the snow. She was younger than he'd expected, though he hadn't had time to expect anything. 23, maybe 24, it was hard to tell with the cold in her face and the snow in her hair, which was dark and plastered against her cheek in a way that made her look like something from a film where the lighting was always being used to mean something. Her coat was completely wrong for Denver in November. It was a camel hair coat, beautiful and thin. The kind of coat that would look excellent in a photograph taken in a city with a more forgiving climate. It was not waterproof. The snow had soaked through the shoulders and the hem was dark with wet. She was wearing low heels, which were entirely incomprehensible. And her hands, she had them pressed together in front of her. Fingers interlaced were white with cold. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "I know it's late. I need somewhere to stay tonight. Just tonight." Ethan looked at her. He looked past her at the street, where a taxi was already disappearing around the corner, its taillights blurring in the snow. No car. No companion. Nothing. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. I'm just cold. And my phone is dead, and I don't know this neighborhood, and I walked for a long time." He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and thought about it. He had grown up being told not to open doors to strangers, and he had lived long enough to understand that this was not paranoia, but simple arithmetic. But he had also grown up watching his mother open their door to people who needed it, and he had lived long enough to understand that too. A small voice behind him said, "Daddy?" He turned. Sophie was standing in the hallway in her flannel pajamas with the penguins on them, holding her stuffed rabbit by one ear. She was looking past him at the young woman in the doorway with an expression of complete and uncomplicated concern. "She looks really cold," Sophie said. Ethan looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The woman's name was Lena. She offered a last name and then seemed to think better of it and let it trail off, and Ethan did not push. He brought her a towel and she sat at the kitchen table while he heated milk on the stove and added cocoa powder and a little sugar, the version he made for Sophie on cold nights, and set the mug in front of her. She wrapped both hands around it and closed her eyes for a moment. Sophie sat across from her without being asked and watched her with the careful attention she gave to things she found interesting. "Is your rabbit's name Mr. Buttons?" Lena asked. She was looking at the stuffed animal. "His name is Warren," Sophie said. "He doesn't have buttons. He's a rabbit." She paused. "Do you have a rabbit?" "I used to," Lena said. Something moved across her face briefly and was gone. Ethan made up the couch with the good blanket from the closet shelf, the one his mother had sent with him when he first moved out and that he had been carrying from place to place for 15 years. He found an extra pillow. He told Lena the bathroom was the second door on the left and that there were clean towels in the cabinet under the sink. "You don't have to do all this," she said. "It's fine," he said. "I'll be gone by morning." "You won't even—" She stopped. She looked at the blanket in her hands. "Thank you," she said. It came out like something she had had to work to release. Sophie did not go back to sleep immediately. This was not unusual. She had always been a child with a strong interest in what was happening outside her bedroom door, and the presence of a stranger in the house was, to her, an event of significant social interest. She sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas and negotiated. With a 6-year-old's complete confidence in the legitimacy of her position, the right to eat half a graham cracker, and ask 3 more questions before being put back to bed. Lena answered the questions. She answered them directly and without the slightly condescending warmth that some adults use with children, which Sophie had a fine-tuned censor for and found offensive. She said yes, she had grown up in Denver, though she had not lived there in several years. She said she had not seen snow in a long time and had forgotten how serious it was. She said her favorite animal, after some consideration, was probably a horse. "Warren is better than a horse," Sophie said firmly. "Horses can't come inside." "That's a strong point," Lena said. Ethan watched this from the counter where he was washing the mugs. He had the sense that Lena was not performing pleasantness, she was simply capable of it when the circumstances allowed, which suggested that the circumstances in her life did not often allow it. There was a quality in how she held herself, even now, sitting in a stranger's kitchen in a borrowed blanket, a kind of trained composure, the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where composure was required and had not yet learned to take it off. Her phone, plugged into the wall with the charger Ethan had found in the junk drawer, had lit up several times since she'd been here. She had looked at it each time and not answered. The screen would flash with what appeared to be a single letter, a name, initial, maybe, and then go dark. He did not ask about it. This was not incuriosity on his part so much as a decision about what kind of person he wanted to be in this particular situation. After Sophie was finally settled and the house was quiet, he came back to the kitchen to find Lena sitting with her knees drawn up on the couch, looking at the wall where Sophie had tacked 3 drawings, a house with a smoking chimney, 2 stick figures he recognized as himself and Sophie, and a third figure in a blue dress that was Claire, though Sophie had never known her mother well enough to know how inexact the likeness was. "Your daughter drew those?" Lena asked. "Yeah." "Who's the one in blue?" He hesitated for a moment. "Her mom," he said. "She passed away." Sophie was 3. Lena looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, and said it in a way that indicated she understood that those 2 words are almost entirely inadequate, and was offering them anyway. "It was a while ago," he said, which was true and also entirely beside the point. He turned off the kitchen light and left her the lamp on the end table. At the hallway, he stopped. "You're safe here," he said. "I just want you to know that. You don't have to worry about anything tonight." Lena did not answer immediately. When she did, she said, "Most people would have called a cab." "The cabs take a long time in this weather," he said. "That's not why you didn't." He did not have an answer for that, so he went to bed. He lay for a while in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about nothing in particular, which was how he usually fell asleep on nights when everything was ordinary. Tonight was not ordinary, but the thinking was still about nothing in particular. The lamp in the living room, the sound of the storm easing off, whether Lena was warm enough under the blanket, whether she was the kind of person who would be up at 5, or the kind who would sleep until the house required her to do otherwise. He decided she was probably the kind who woke early. She had the quality of someone for whom sleep was a practical transaction rather than a pleasure. He had met a few people like that. They were usually people with very full heads. He thought, briefly, about the initial on her phone screen. A single letter. He did not know whether it was a name that started with A or a name that started with something else entirely, and he was not going to think about it anymore. And he went to sleep. He was up at 6, which was usual. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched the street. The snow had stopped overnight but left a deep, uniform whiteness across everything: the cars, the yards, the sagging roof of the Hendersons' garage 2 doors down. The world had that strange, pressurized silence that follows heavy snowfall, as if it were listening for something. Lena was already awake. He could hear water running in the bathroom. By the time he had poured 2 mugs, she came into the kitchen, her dark coat dried overnight and her hair pulled back. She looked different in the morning light, less like someone being asked questions and more like someone preparing to ask them. "I'll get out of your way," she said. "There's coffee," he said. She sat and took the mug, and they were both quiet for a moment. Outside, a neighbor was scraping the windshield of a truck. The sound was rhythmic and domestic and ordinary in a way that the preceding night had not been. "I should tell you who I am," Lena said. "You don't have to," he said. "My name is Lena Whitmore," she said. "My father is Charles Whitmore." Ethan looked at her. He knew the name. Everyone in Denver who had spent any time near commercial real estate, civic boards, or the business section of any newspaper knew the name. Charles Whitmore had been reshaping the Denver skyline for 30 years. Whitmore Development was the kind of company that turned entire city blocks into something else and called the result progress. The man himself was known for being decisive in the specific way that people with a great deal of money can afford to be decisive, which is to say, in a way that left very little room for disagreement. "Okay," Ethan said. "I left my father's house last night," she said. "I took a taxi, and the taxi got stuck 2 streets over, and I started walking, and I didn't know where I was going. I should have called someone, but I didn't want to call anyone I know because everyone I know works for my father in some capacity, and that felt like." She stopped. "I just walked," she said, "and then I saw your light." "My porch light?" he said. "I leave it on for the meter reader." "It was on," she said, simply. He was going to say something else, but Sophie appeared in the doorway in her penguin pajamas, and the morning took a different shape. He made oatmeal, and they ate together, the 3 of them, and Sophie told Lena about dolphins with a thoroughness that left no significant dolphin-related topic unaddressed. Lena asked 2 questions that were genuinely good questions about echolocation and about whether dolphins slept, and Sophie answered them with the authority of a person who has done serious library research, which she had. He had just pulled on his coat to go out and clear the walk when he heard Sophie at the front window say, in the alert tone she used for things she found remarkable, "Daddy, there are a lot of cars." He looked out. 4 black SUVs had stopped on Garfield Street, arranged with a precision that was not accidental. The engines were still running. Steam rose from the exhausts in the cold air. Men in dark coats were getting out, not in a hurry, but with the deliberate economy of movement that suggests training. Last to emerge from the rear vehicle was a man in a gray overcoat, tall, somewhere in his mid-60s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since settled into something more authoritative. He stood on the sidewalk in front of Ethan's house and looked at it the way a structural engineer looks at a building he has not yet decided whether to demolish. Ethan set down his snow shovel. Charles Whitmore did not move toward the house immediately. He stood on the walk and let the moment do whatever work it was going to do. And Ethan had the distinct impression that this was a technique that the man had learned somewhere along the way, that stillness, deployed correctly, was its own form of pressure. Ethan came down the porch steps. The snow was ankle-deep and hadn't been cleared yet, and he was aware of this the way you become aware of every small disadvantage in the presence of someone who has none. "Mr. Cole," the man said. He did not phrase it as a question, which meant he already knew who Ethan was, which meant the previous 8 hours had been less anonymous than they had felt. "Yes," Ethan said. "I'm Charles Whitmore." He said the name the way people say names that they know will register. "My daughter was in your home last night." "She was," Ethan said. "She was cold, and it was late, and she needed somewhere to stay. She slept on my couch." "I see." The gray eyes moved from Ethan's face to the house behind him, to the snow shovel leaning against the porch rail, to the boots Ethan was wearing that had been resoled twice and showed it. "I'm not interested in whatever you're looking at," Ethan said. "I know what this house looks like. I live in it." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression barely. But it shifted. The front door opened. Lena came out onto the porch. She had her coat on, and she had found her composure again, which Ethan thought was probably a reflex she had built over years. She walked down the steps and stood beside him, which was a choice that was not ambiguous. "Dad," she said. "I'm fine." He didn't. He was kind. He just let me stay. Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long moment. The quality of that look, whatever combination of relief and interrogation and old, accumulated worry it contained, was not something he was broadcasting to the men standing behind him. It was addressed only to Lena. "Did you call the house?" he said. "I was." He stopped. "Mrs. Ferris called the police at midnight," he said. Mrs. Ferris was apparently a housekeeper. The information conveyed itself with the weight of an accusation that he had not quite decided to make. "I know," Lena said. "I'm sorry. I should have called. But I needed to not be reachable for one night, and I thought—" She looked at her father directly. "I thought one night of that wouldn't hurt anyone." The breath of silence that followed this was the longest of the morning. One of the men in dark coats had moved a few steps closer to the porch, and Ethan became aware of him in the way you become aware of a dog that has not yet decided whether you are a threat. He did not move. "Mr. Cole," Whitmore said again, "I'd like to come inside, if you'll permit it." Ethan looked at the man. He looked at Lena, who gave him the slight nod of someone who understands that what they are asking costs something. He stepped back from the door. Charles Whitmore did not bring his men inside. He left them on the walk with a word and came in alone, which Ethan suspected was a concession of some kind, or possibly a tactic it was hard to know. With a man like this, where the genuine gestures ended and the calculated ones began. He moved through Ethan's hallway the way a man moves through a space that is entirely unlike any space he normally occupies. Not with contempt. Ethan watched carefully for contempt and did not find it. What he found was something closer to attention. The particular attentiveness of someone encountering unfamiliar conditions and taking notes. The kitchen was its usual morning state, 3 oatmeal bowls in the dish rack, Sophie's dolphin book open on the table, a crayon drawing of a fish on top of the refrigerator where Sophie had left it last week. Ethan did not apologize for any of it. He poured a third mug of coffee and set it on the table without being asked. Whitmore sat. He looked at the fish, drawing for a moment. "Dolphins," came Sophie's voice from the hallway. She had materialized, as she often did, at the precise moment when her presence would be most sociologically interesting. She was holding Warren by the ear and regarding Whitmore with the direct, unembarrassed assessment that is the exclusive province of small children and very confident adults. "That's a dolphin, not a fish. They're mammals. They breathe air." "I see," Whitmore said. "I stand corrected." He said it with a formality that was not unkind, and Sophie apparently found it acceptable, because she came into the kitchen and climbed into her chair. "Are you Lena's dad?" she asked. "I am. She was really cold last night. Daddy made her hot chocolate." Sophie considered him for a moment. "Do you make her hot chocolate?" Whitmore looked at his daughter, who was standing in the doorway with her hands in her coat pockets. Some calculation ran silently through his face. "Not recently," he said. He drank the coffee. He set the mug down. He said, without looking at Ethan, "You didn't ask her anything. About who she was, where she was from." "She didn't want to say," Ethan said. "That seemed like her right. A lot of men would have asked anyway." "I'm not a lot of men," Ethan said. "Not as a boast, just as a fact." Whitmore turned and looked at him directly for the first time. The gray eyes were sharp in the way that years of making consequential decisions make eyes sharp. They moved over things quickly and arrived at conclusions without broadcasting the process. "Why open the door?" he said. "To someone you don't know, in the middle of the night, in a storm. You have a child in the house. Any reasonable person would have called someone. Ethan thought about how to answer this honestly. When Sophie was 18 months old, he said, she had croup. Bad. It was January, and it was 2 in the morning, and I was driving to Children's Hospital, and I blew a tire on Federal. I had a car seat and a sick kid and a blown tire in the dark, and I was out of my mind. He paused. A woman came out of her house. She'd heard the car. She stood in the cold with Sophie while I changed the tire. She didn't know me. She didn't ask. He looked at Whitmore. I think about that sometimes, about what I'd have done without her. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Sophie was drawing something on the back of an envelope. The radiator ticked. Whitmore said nothing. But he picked up his coffee again and held it in both hands, and something in the set of his shoulders changed. It was Sophie who changed the temperature of the room, though she did it without knowing she was doing it, which was the only way she ever did anything. She had finished her drawing and slid off her chair and gone to the living room. And when she returned, she was carrying Warren at arm's length, the way she carried him when she was considering a loan rather than a gift. She walked past her father, past Lena, and stopped in front of Charles Whitmore. "This is Warren," she said. "He helps when things are bad. You can borrow him if you want, but I need him back because he sleeps with me." Whitmore looked at the rabbit. It was the kind of stuffed animal that has been loved into a state somewhat removed from its original condition. The plush, worn thin in places, one ear slightly more floppy than the other from being carried that way for years, the stitched nose a little crooked. Someone had repaired a seam along the back with thread that didn't quite match. He reached out and took the rabbit with both hands and sat holding it for a moment, and Ethan saw something happen in the man's face that he could not entirely interpret, except that it was real in a way that the composure before it had not been. "Lena had one of these," Whitmore said. "Not to anyone in particular. Different color, gray. She called it—" He stopped. "She was about your age," he said to Sophie. "What happened to it?" Sophie asked. "I don't remember," Whitmore said, which Ethan suspected was not entirely true but was possibly true enough. The truth about what happened to childhood things was often less like a story and more like an absence that developed gradually and was only noticed long after. The thing itself was gone. Lena had not moved from the doorway during any of this. Ethan glanced at her and saw that she was watching her father with an expression he recognized from his own experience, the expression of a person who loves someone they have also spent a long time being angry with and who is watching that person do something unexpected with the accumulated complications of their history. Whitmore returned the rabbit to Sophie with the solemnity appropriate to the loan of something important. Sophie accepted it and returned to her chair. There was a period of quiet in which the house did what it usually did. The radiator spoke, the floor settled, the refrigerator ran. These were sounds that Ethan had stopped hearing long ago because they were simply the house being the house. But in the company of this man with his idling SUVs and his expensive gray coat, they seemed to announce themselves. Whitmore said, "You manage this house alone." "Yes," Ethan said. "And your work, HVAC. Commercial and residential." Whitmore nodded once. He appeared to be making a calculation. Ethan did not know what the components of the calculation were, but he was fairly sure he was not being assessed for a threat level anymore. They were on the porch when Whitmore made it. He had shaken Ethan's hand in the kitchen, a formal gesture, almost old-fashioned, and then gone to say something private to Lena, and then he came back to where Ethan was standing, and they walked together to the top of the porch steps. The morning had opened up. The storm was completely gone, and the sky was that particular deep winter blue that Denver produced in its most beautiful moments. And the snow on the lawns and the parked cars was bright and unbroken in the light. "You could have called someone," Whitmore said. "When you found out who she was." "I found out this morning," Ethan said. Whitmore looked at him. "You could have asked her." "Last night." "I could have," Ethan said, "but she didn't want to answer, and the question wasn't important to me." "Not important," Whitmore repeated. "She was cold," Ethan said. "She needed somewhere warm. Whether she was important or not wasn't relevant to that." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Down the street, one of his men was clearing snow from the windshield of an SUV, working methodically and without particular impatience. the way men who work for powerful people learn to occupy waiting time. I have, Whitmore said carefully, a property management division. 43 residential and commercial buildings across the metro area. We use a facilities contractor for maintenance, coordination, heating, plumbing, electrical, the full scope. The contract comes up for renewal in February. He paused. The current contractor has become unreliable. Ethan looked at him. I'm not interested in your gratitude, Whitmore said. I've had enough people grateful to me to know that gratitude is a bad basis for a professional relationship. I'm interested in someone who does exactly what he says he'll do, shows up exactly when he says he'll show up, and doesn't ask questions that aren't his to ask. You're talking about a contract, Ethan said. I'm talking about a conversation, Whitmore said. The contract would require a conversation first, and an evaluation of whether the scope of the work is something you're equipped to handle. I work alone, Ethan said. Not for 43 buildings. You don't, Whitmore said. There was, for the first time, something almost dry in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but the proximity of it. Come to my office Thursday, 10 o'clock. My assistant's name is Renata, and she'll have a visitor badge waiting. He walked down the steps and along the cleared portion of the walk that his men had apparently done while they were inside, which Ethan noticed now for the first time. At the car, he turned once. Mr. Cole, he said. Yes, your porch light is out on the left side. Ethan looked. It was. I'll fix it, he said. Whitmore got in the car. The building was on 17th Street, 42 floors of glass and steel that caught the winter light and threw it back in long angles across the surrounding blocks. Ethan had driven past it 100 times in the course of service calls in the downtown corridor, and had registered it the way you register large, permanent features of a landscape without particular consideration of what happened. Inside, he had eaten his lunch once in his truck on 17th, parked in a loading zone for 12 minutes while the meter ran, and looked up at the tower and thought about something other than the tower entirely. This was, in retrospect, a perfectly appropriate response to a building that had not yet had anything to do with him. He parked in a public garage 2 blocks over because the visitor parking at Whitmore Tower required a validation code that Renata had apparently forgotten to include when she confirmed the appointment, and he did not want to be late explaining a parking situation to a man like Whitmore. He wore his good shirt, he owned 2, and the good one was navy, and he had ironed it the evening before while Sophie told him for the 3rd time about a documentary she had watched about humpback whales. Renata was at the reception desk and had his badge ready, as promised. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the brisk, assessing manner of someone who has spent 20 years managing the logistics of a demanding person and has made her peace with it. Mr. Whitmore is in the 41st floor conference room, she said. He asked me to tell you the elevator on the right is faster. The 41st floor was what the lobby was trying to announce. It would be panoramic windows, good furniture, the kind of quiet that expensive square footage produces. Lena was there, which surprised him, sitting at the long conference table with a laptop and a legal pad. She looked up when he came in. I asked to be here, she said, preempting the question. I'm the head of the residential portfolio. The buildings we're talking about are mine. Whitmore came in 3 minutes later with 2 other men whom he introduced as the head of facilities and the company's general counsel. The meeting was conducted with a directness that Ethan found, to his surprise, comfortable. There was no performance of power, no circling. Whitmore asked specific questions and listened to the answers and then asked the next question. The scope was significant. 43 properties, a mix of residential and light commercial, ranging from a 6-unit apartment building in Capitol Hill to a renovated warehouse complex in Rhino. The work was primarily mechanical HVAC systems, heating plants, boiler rooms, ventilation. The previous contractor, a company called Frontier Mechanical, had been consistently failing response time requirements and had twice sent technicians who could not competently diagnose the systems they were being paid to service. Our tenants in the residential buildings are largely working families, Lena said. When a heating system fails in January, We have elderly residents and small children who are affected within hours. We've had 2 failures this year where response time was over 12 hours. She looked at him steadily. That's not acceptable to me. It wouldn't be acceptable to me either, Ethan said. He asked about the boiler systems in the older buildings, their age, manufacturer, service history. He asked about the ventilation configurations in the warehouse complex. He asked whether there was a maintenance log for each property and whether it was current. The questions were practical and specific, and he could see, without making a point of noticing it, that Whitmore was noting this. They talked for 2 hours. At the end of it, Whitmore's counsel outlined the contract terms, which were structured as an annual retainer with a per-incident rate for emergency calls. The retainer figure was, on its own, more than Ethan earned in a year at Caldwell Mechanical. He kept his face even. This would require you to bring on additional personnel, Whitmore said. You can't run 43 properties solo. I know 2 people, Ethan said. Both good. Both currently working for outfits that don't pay them what they're worth. Whitmore looked at him for a moment. Bring them in for a conversation, he said. If they're as good as you say, we'll work it into the contract structure. He stood. The meeting was over. He extended his hand, and Ethan shook it. And this time, the handshake had a different quality than the one on the porch. Less assessment, more transaction between equals. Lena walked him to the elevator. They stood waiting for it, with the slight, agreeable awkwardness of people who have something more to say and are deciding whether this is the moment. How are you feeling about all of it? She said. Honestly? He looked at the elevator doors. Like I should probably go buy a better notepad. She laughed, which was the first time he had heard her laugh freely, not the polite laugh from the kitchen the night they met, but the real kind. Brief and unguarded. You'll be good at it, she said. The scope, the properties. You already know what the problems are before anyone has to explain them to you. I know boilers, he said. That's not what I meant, she said. The elevator arrived. He got in and turned, and she was already walking back toward the conference room with her legal pad under her arm, and she did not look back, which he found he did not mind. In the elevator, on the way down, Ethan stood with his good shirt and his parking ticket and the weight of a number in his head that was not quite real yet, and watched the floors count down and thought about a heat exchanger on a yellow legal pad. Spring in Denver arrives the way good news sometimes does, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence, then all at once. By March, the snow was retreating from the south-facing yards, and the afternoons had that particular quality of light that made the city look like a city that had been waiting patiently for permission to be seen. Things had changed on Garfield Street in ways that were visible and in ways that were not. The visible ones. The porch light on the left side worked. The weather stripping on the front door had been replaced. The furnace had a new heat exchanger, installed on a Saturday in February by Ethan and his friend Marcus Webb, whom he had brought on as his first hire under the new contract, a man he'd worked beside at Caldwell for 6 years, careful and unhurried and excellent with older systems. There was a second car in the drive now, a used pickup in reasonable shape that didn't start uncertainly in the cold. Sophie had started at a different school, one with a music program, because she had announced in January that she wanted to learn the violin, which was an announcement that Ethan had received with the specific combination of pride and mild terror that her announcements usually produced. The less visible ones were harder to describe. He had more space, now, between the problem in front of him and the edge of what he could manage. This was not wealth. He was not operating under any illusion about what the contract represented versus what his life was, but it was margin. And margin was its own kind of quiet. He slept differently. He did not always turn the legal pad over. Marcus had brought in a third hire by February, a plumber named Darius Webb, no relation, from the same union local where they had all spent years working side jobs on a budget that required creative interpretation of the word adequate. Darius was large and methodical and had a talent for explaining complicated problems in language that building managers could understand and act on, which was a talent Ethan had not thought to consider as a hiring criterion until he saw it in practice and recognized how essential it was. The three of them developed a working rhythm quickly, the way people who are competent and respect competence tend to do without requiring much discussion of who was in charge of what. The work itself was satisfying in a way that Ethan had not anticipated. Not because it was different from what he had done before a boiler was a boiler. A failing heat exchanger had the same failure signature at a Whitmore property as it did anywhere else, but because of the scale. He could see, across 43 properties, what a responsive maintenance operation looked like as opposed to a reactive one. He could plan. He could identify the systems that were 12 months from failure and schedule them before January made the situation an emergency. This was, he found, enormously more interesting than arriving after the fact. Lena came by sometimes. Not frequently. She was someone with a full life and a complicated relationship with her father's city and didn't make it back to Denver more than once or twice a month, but she came. She and Sophie had arrived at an understanding that had something to do with the Dolphin book and something to do with Warren, and something to do with the particular ease that develops between an adult and a child when neither of them is performing for the other. She would sit at the kitchen table with her coffee and listen to Sophie's reports on the violin program with the same direct attention she had given the Dolphin facts, and Sophie accepted this as entirely natural. The relationship between Ethan and Lena was something he had not tried to name, because naming things had a way of obligating them to remain the names you gave them. She was someone he was glad to know. She was someone who had arrived on his porch in a thin coat in the snow, and who had turned out to be, in the daylight and over months, a person he found consistently worth spending time with. What shape that took over time was a question for time. It was the first Saturday in April when Charles Whitmore appeared on Garfield Street again. He came alone this time. No motorcade. A single car, a dark sedan, which he parked at the curb himself. He was wearing a less formal coat than the last time, and he stood on the walk for a moment before coming up to the porch, looking at the yard where Sophie was working on something complex with a stick, some stones, and a system of philosophy that was entirely internal and apparently very serious. Ethan was on the porch with a coffee, watching her. He had the Sunday kind of quiet around him. No calls dispatched yet, nothing due, the week's work not yet begun. "She seems well," Whitmore said, from the walk. "She always seems well," Ethan said. "It's a talent she has." Whitmore came up the steps. Ethan got him a coffee from inside without making an occasion of it, and when he came back, Whitmore was standing at the porch rail looking at Sophie. "How's the contract working out?" Ethan said. "Renata tells me the response logs are clean," Whitmore said. "First time in 4 years." He paused. "There was a boiler failure at the Capitol Hill property in February. Night call. Your man Webb? Marcus. He was on site in 40 minutes and had the system running in 3 hours. We had 17 units that would have been without heat until morning." He said this matter-of-factly, as if delivering a report. The tenants left notes for the property manager, thanking him by name. "Marcus is good," Ethan said. "Yes," Whitmore said. They stood for a while with their coffees. Sophie had incorporated a new element into her project, a length of string she had found somewhere, and the philosophy was expanding accordingly. "Lena tells me you've been good to her," Whitmore said. "In the way you've been," he paused, not with discomfort, but with the deliberateness of someone choosing words carefully, "in how you've been around her. That you don't ask more than what she wants to give." Ethan did not say anything. "It's a rarer quality than you might think," Whitmore said. "In the circles she moves in, people want things from her. Her time, her access, her position. It becomes," he stopped. "She has been learning, for most of her adult life, to be cautious. I am partly responsible for that." This was, Ethan understood, a significant statement for a man like Whitmore to make, and he received it without comment, because comment would have reduced it. Sophie came to the base of the porch steps and looked up at them. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "do you want to see my project?" "It's a system." "What kind of system?" Whitmore said. "For keeping track of important rocks," Sophie said. "There are more important rocks than people think." Whitmore set his coffee down on the porch rail and came down the steps and crouched in the mud beside her project and looked at it with the gravity appropriate to a serious system, and Sophie began her explanation, and Ethan watched the two of them from the porch. There were things that money had gotten him, in these past months, that he was genuinely grateful for: the margin, the heat, the truck, the school with the violin. He was not above gratitude for practical things. He had been cold enough and close enough to the edge to know that the practical things mattered. But there was this: the particular quality of a Saturday morning with nothing due. Sophie's voice in the yard, explaining a rock classification system to a man who had 42 floors of his name on 17th Street and was crouching in the mud, listening. The porch, the coffee, the light. That evening, after Whitmore had gone and Sophie was in her bath and the house was making its usual sounds, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a new yellow legal pad and wrote down the names of the 12 properties that needed system assessments before summer. He wrote neatly, in the way a man writes when he is not in a hurry, when the page is not something he will need to turn over. Outside, the street lamp was steady, fixed, at last, by the city. Its light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table in a clean yellow band, and the house was warm, and he could hear his daughter singing something to Warren that was not any song he recognized, which meant it was one of her own. The violin, Ethan's neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, reported with some feeling, could be heard through the shared wall on Tuesday and Thursday evenings between 5 and 6 o'clock, and while she was not complaining, she was very clear that she was not complaining. She wanted Ethan to know that her cat found it unsettling, Ethan told Sophie. Sophie thought about this for 24 hours and then wrote Mrs. Kowalski a note in her best handwriting, explaining that she was learning a new instrument and that she would try to play facing away from the wall. She signed it Sophie Cole and added a small drawing of a cat. Mrs. Kowalski came over 2 days later with a plate of butter cookies. There were more notes, after that, between the houses. Small domestic diplomacies. Mrs. Kowalski brought cookies. Ethan shoveled her walk without being asked. Sophie reported on the progress of the violin lessons with a thoroughness that Mrs. Kowalski appeared to find either charming or exhausting, and possibly both. A small warmth developed between the households, the kind that requires no announcement and no negotiation, that happens because two people decide, without saying so, to be decent to each other across the ordinary distance between neighbors. This was not a large thing. It was the size of a note and a plate of cookies and a cleared walk in March. But Ethan had come to believe that this was the actual scale of most things, that the large events of a life were made of these small ones, accumulated over time, in the same way that any structure worth building is made of ordinary material, joined well, maintained. On the last Friday of April, Lena came for dinner. She brought a bottle of wine that was better than anything in Ethan's kitchen had ever had to relate to, and she sat with Sophie through the entire violin practice session, 35 minutes of something that was working, toward becoming a melody, and said afterward that she thought Sophie had real pitch. "She's being nice," Ethan said after Sophie went to bed. "I'm not, actually," Lena said. She was at the kitchen table with her wine and the easy posture of someone who had stopped needing to compose herself in this particular kitchen. "She's got good intonation for 4 months in." Asked the teacher. "You know about violin?" "I played until I was 16, she said. "My father thought it was impractical." Ethan looked at her. She smiled in a way that had everything in it: the old argument with her father, the years between, and something present that was not those things at all. "What happened when you were 16, he said. "I put it down," she said. "I don't remember exactly why, probably because someone told me to." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about picking it up again." "Sophie would be scandalized if you were better than her," Ethan said. "Then I'll make sure not to be," Lena said. For the first year, at least. They sat for a while with the kitchen the way it was, the violin in its case. The table between them with the wine and the 2 glasses. The window showing the yard going dark in the spring evening. Lena refilled both glasses without asking, and he found he was glad she had. "Your father asked me last month," Ethan said. Whether I thought the Capitol Hill boiler plant could run another 3 winters. What did you tell him? 2 winters if we're careful. 1 if we're not. What did he say? He told me to order the replacement unit and schedule the install for September. Lena nodded. He trusts you, she said. That's not a small thing from him. I know, Ethan said. He did know. He had come to understand, in the months of working with Charles Whitmore at the specific remove that a contractor maintains from a client, that the man's confidence was not given carelessly and was not withdrawn without cause. He was difficult in the way that people with high standards and limited patience for approximation are difficult, but the standards themselves were comprehensible, and the difficulty was consistent, which made it manageable. Ethan had worked for people whose difficulty was arbitrary, and whose standards shifted, and he knew the difference. Outside, the street lamp held steady. The spring air came through the cracked window, still cold at night, but with the first suggestion of something else underneath it, something that was willing to be warm. Inside, the house was lit and occupied and making its usual sounds, which were the sounds of a house with a life in it. The violin leaning against the wall in its case, the dolphin book on the table, Warren on the couch where Sophie had left him, the coffee cooling on the counter. 2 people at the kitchen table talking about something and then something else. The conversation running easily the way water runs when the channel is clear. The porch light was on. Both of them.